One, Peter Davison stars in a new four-part Doctor Who story, Earthshock.
In March of 1982, the Doctor Who story Earthshock made its premiere broadcast on BBC One in the United Kingdom. Lasting 4 episodes, this story was shown on a Monday and Tuesday early evening, over a 2-week period. In this almost anonymous television schedule slot, we witnessed the return of the Cybermen, in a story that many consider one of the strongest stories of the 80s, and one which always ranks very highly on top Cybermen story lists. But before the first episode, due to the great lengths the production team took in protecting the storyline, Doctor Who fans and casual viewers alike had no idea what they were about to witness. Earthshock captured lightning in a bottle. All the elements of the story came together perfectly, in a great example of the whole exceeding the sum of its parts. Written by Eric Saward under the supervision of, Eric Saward, and produced superbly by John Nathan Turner, this story bravely explored new grounds for the series. In this mini-documentary, we're going to explore the complex origins of the story, the production that realised a superb script, and the aftermath of some truly shocking aspects of the adventure. We'll also explore why the success of Earthshock created an unintended consequence for Saward and Nathan Turner that disrupted many of the stories that were to follow. Earthshock saw the long-awaited return of the Cybermen, having only appeared in just one story previously in a 14-year period. The invasion aired way back in 1968, with Revenge of the Cybermen temporarily puncturing their absence in 1975. The frequent use of the Cybermen in the late 1960s, and then the almost absence in the 1970s was, bizarrely, caused by the Dalek creator. No, not Davros, Terry Nation. In the mid-60s, at the height of Dalek mania, Terry Nation, who owned the full rights to the Daleks, decided that he wanted to launch the Daleks into their own series outside of Doctor Who. These waters had already been tested in the UK, with Nation agreeing to their use in commercials, comics, toys, and the 2 Dalek movies. But he planned bigger, much bigger. Nation told the BBC that he was withdrawing their rights to use the Daleks, as he was attempting to launch them over the Atlantic in America as a standalone project independent of the series. Bear in mind that the US syndication of the series was still a number of years away, meaning that Nation had a fresh canvas to work on. The BBC production team, doing what they were best at, saw this risk and put in place plans to replace their prize villains and slowly move the Cybermen into the main event position in time for what was widely considered to be the final Doctor Who Dalek story, Evil of the Daleks, in 1967. For the next few years, in the absence of the Daleks, the Cybermen took main stage. And this position remained until 1972, when the Daleks made their return to the series in Day of the Daleks. In a story that was originally titled The Ghost Hunters and didn't feature the Daleks, the production team got notification that Terry Nation, on account of his less than successful attempt to export the Daleks, decided to allow the BBC to use his creations once more, for a fee. So the Daleks were shoehorned into this story, signalling their return to the series. And in doing so, they displaced the Cybermen who had arguably been overused in the previous 5 years. So throughout the 1970s, during both the John Pertwee and Tom Baker eras, the Cybermen were rested. With the exception of Revenge of the Cybermen in 1975, this story is highly regarded by some fans, but as a Cyberman story, it certainly misses the mark. The Cyberman costumes were by and large reused from the invasion, and they'd lost most of their menace. They had developed sarcasm, performed wild gestures, spoke with an accent,
All resistance overcome,
and stood with their hands on their hips. And they sat down consistently. I remember as a child wondering why Cybermen needed to sit down. This lacklustre addition to the Cybermen legacy could very well have signalled their end in the classic series. Earthshock, or any Cyberman story for that matter, didn't feature in the plans for season 19 at all. It was a late addition to pre-production after the intended story to fill this 4-part block was cancelled. Titled The Enemy Within, this story was also set to feature the death of Adric. It was to be written by Doctor Who newcomer Christopher Priest. However, it was cancelled quite late on in production. There's no record as to why this story was cancelled, but given the writer never penned another story, it's quite likely his scripts were unsuitable for the series. There is record of Priest claiming some compensation for his writing that was paid, and that he went away from the series with some quite strong bad feelings towards the production team, with John Nathan Turner in particular being a target. John Nathan Turner was not initially excited about the return of the Cybermen. He was keen to put his mark on the production without reverting to old but classic monsters. He wanted to be innovative and create a set of new monsters for his own era. However, he was smart enough to know that Cybermen pulled in viewers, and ratings were the most important thing for the success of any series. So when newly promoted script editor Eric Saward approached John Nathan Turner with a concept for a script that featured the return of the Cybermen, JNT gave it the green light with support from both Peter Davison and series advisor Ian Levine. Unlike John Nathan Turner, Eric Saward was a big fan of Cybermen, at least from a writing point of view. Said Saward, "Terence Dix once said that I have an obsession with the Cybermen, which is not far from the truth. To me, they're much more fascinating than Daleks and offered a much more plausible chilling opposition to their opponents." So Saward set about putting together a treatment for a script that at the time was named Sentinel. He envisioned a feature film production. Saward was always very open about drawing his inspiration from the Patrick Troughton adventure Tomb of the Cybermen visuals rather than the story, and said in late 1982, when Tomb of the Cybermen was still lost, "I watched all the old Cybermen tapes still existing, and, noting that Cybermen had physically changed from story to story, and that there were inconsistencies anyway with their history, it was a matter of trying to make sense out of what I could and what was there." It was quite deliberate that Earthshock was such a collation of everything from Tomb of the Cybermen. It was said that I'd studied that one in particular, which was not true. I hadn't even read the script. In fact, I saw in Doctor Who Monthly a selection of photographs from it and a synopsis of the story, and I liked it so much, the image of them breaking out their tombs, that I wanted to try to incorporate that sort of element into Earthshock. It was a conscious effort on my part to try to bring back the impact I thought the Cybermen had. Of all the old monsters, the Cybermen are my favourites. They're very menacing as a concept, being physically so large, so militaristic, and ruthlessly dedicated. So Saward hastily completed the script, paying homage to the iconic visuals of Tomb of the Cybermen, and reinstating the Cybermen as a formidable foe, rather than the pantomime characters they had become. This was the first Cybermen script that had no involvement from their original creators, Kit Pedler and Jerry Davis. They did, however, receive a copyright payment. But there was a problem. As now script editor of the series, Saward was not permitted to supervise his own scripts. So previous script editor Anthony Root was kept on the books to provide script supervision to Saward. He'd actually left the series to work on another BBC programme, a police procedural programme called Juliet Bravo. How much supervision Root took has always been up for debate, with almost all reports suggesting none. On a side note, Eric Saward had a similar problem with his second Cybermen script a few years later, Attack of the Cybermen. To circumnavigate this, he simply gave the writing credit to Paula Woolsey, or Paula Moore, or Ian Levine, anyone but himself. That the script wasn't supervised led to probably some of the greatest strengths of the story, but also directly fed into some of the problems later Peter Davison's stories would experience. For this story, John Nathan Turner decided to update the image of the Cybermen. Since taking on the production reins, he'd set out to update the show, and in doing so, we saw new graphics, a new version of the theme, and new opening title sequence. The Cybermen costumes last seen 7 years earlier were not fit for purpose for this new glossy era. J&T commissioned new Cybermen costumes with Dina Collin working with an external company, Imagineering, to complete the new look. They'd already worked on the series, having created costumes and effects for Castrovalva, Fort Doomsday, and The Visitation. Dina Collin wanted to remove the handlebar section of the headpieces, but John Nathan Turner rejected this idea. It was also pointed out by Ian Levine, unofficial advisor to the series, that only the Cyber Controller should lack handlebars. Designer Richard Gregory also contributed significantly to the new look of these Cybermen. However, due to not getting direct on-screen credit, his work is rarely acknowledged. He admitted that the new look of the Cybermen was partially inspired by the 1978 series Battlestar Galactica, but not the character you may be thinking of. He considered the headgear of the Viper pilots in the series to work well, and incorporated those into the new cyber heads. Another suggestion was to have visible fluids in the tubes, but this never manifested. Cost and complication are the likely reasons. Dina Collin also suggested removing the gloves from the costume to expose human hands, calling back to their earliest appearance. I really like this idea, and should it have been done really carefully, would have added a very different level of realism to the costumes. In 1988, Dina Collins spoke to David Banks for his Cybermen book and said of her many concepts, "We had this idea that the body of the actor would become part of the outer skin. Instead of having gloves on the hands, it would have been nice to build them up with makeup. It would have been an extension of this funny suit, which had tubes on it already, and I thought that if you brought up the tubes over the chin and into the mouth, then the helmet part would grow from that. There wouldn't have been any clear division where the body ended and the helmet began." In total, 7 new costumes were made, and while maintaining the DNA of the Cybermen design, achieved a brand new look that was to define their appearance for the 80s. While they had some minor changes over each of their remaining 3 stories, this is how the Cybermen saw out the classic era. The overhaul of the costume was set off with a new transparent lower jaw, affectionately known by fans as the glass jaw, an idea made by John Nathan Turner. While quite a minor change, this reminded viewers that Cybermen were human, not just mere robots, and it was a very effective practical effect. Peter Davison said of the costume update, "The thing I liked about the new Cybermen was the idea that, rather than a totally inanimate face, you could see the hint of something moving underneath. Because there is meant to be something inside the suit, the Cybermen are not actually robots. I like this new side of them. In the 10th Planet, the Cybermen had a sort of stocking mask over the face of the actor. The voices were wonderful as well. Not at all like the latest Cybermen voices, which I feel are a bit too Dalek-like. In their last story, the accent was always on the wrong words, and it was really quite jolly." Anyway, the Cybermen had to be redesigned for Earthshock, and I thought they looked really very good. There was this Perspex chin, of course, but what was underneath it was quite complicated. Maybe you didn't see enough of it. I thought it gave the impression of this shriveled thing under there speaking. I told David Banks, who played the cyber leader, about the early voice, and I thought he was very good because he incorporated that approach with the modern treatment. I thought he came up with a very good cross between the slightly strange jolliness and the later Dalek-like voice. While the glass jaw was an amazing effect, it was less apparent in all following Cybermen stories. The reason for this is explained by the filming process. The actors delivered lines in real time, amplified by a microphone unit concealed within the headpiece. These were later re-recorded by the sound team and suitably adjusted to give the distinctive cyber tones.
Destroy them at once!
The redubbing of this to achieve reasonable lip sync was probably very both time consuming and very awkward. Further, during filming, the microphone unit would often become displaced and could be seen in the jaw area in a number of shots. In subsequent stories, to avoid this complex lip syncing and visible microphone unit being so obvious, the glass jaw was made more opaque. When he learnt of the intention to kill off his character, Matthew Waterhouse is reported not to have spoken with John Nathan Turner for some weeks. J&T resolved this situation by pointing out to Matthew Waterhouse that, as he was a time traveller, the Doctor could always meet Adric again. Interestingly, the final word of Peter Davison's Doctor when he regenerated was Adric.
You know that, Doctor.
Adric?
While the death of Adric in this story was a surprise to almost all viewers, the departure of Matthew Waterhouse as Adric from the series at some point in the future was somewhat anticipated. Many writers had complained to JNT that trying to write for the Doctor and 3 companions was a challenge, and in many cases Adric was getting the crumbs from each script. One of the motivators for John Nathan Turner to kill off a companion was to bring some gritty realism to his era. He wanted to introduce a real threat to characters, with the audience experiencing real concern from week to week. This is a concept that the Game of Thrones mastered perfectly many years later. Peter Grimwade was hired as director for this story. He had worked on Doctor Who previously as a production assistant during the John Pertwee and Tom Baker era, with his first outing as a full director being on Full Circle, with John Nathan Turner producing, in 1980. He envisioned a cinematic feel for this story and got John Nathan Turner and Eric Saward on board with this idea. His camera scripts were, as a result, very long and very detailed for a television drama of that era. Malcolm Clarke was commissioned to provide the incidental music for the series, and in doing so delivered the haunting March of the Cybermen used throughout the story. A variant of this was later used in Attack of the Cybermen. Clarke had not composed for the series for 10 years, but provided many themes for the early Jon Pertwee era. He was a pioneer of the EMS Synthy 100 and used this to create unique sounds, most notably for the Sea Devil story in 1972. Director Peter Grimwade was not happy with the composition for Earthshock, going so far as telling Clarke that he hated it, and he inquired as to whether Peter Howe could provide a late substitute. He couldn't, so the Clarke version remains. It's unclear why Grimwade disliked it so much, with most audiences reporting that the theme adds something very special to the story. Producer John Nathan Turner was very keen to keep the surprises of the episode secret. He took a number of steps to achieve this. During studio filming, he closed down the observation gallery to prevent nosy BBC employees looking on. It's reported that he asked all production and on-screen talent to refrain from talking about the story to anyone until broadcast. This resulted in a rather comical quip from a reviewer many years later, who said that John Nathan Turner probably didn't have to tell Beryl Reid, as she had absolutely no idea what was going on anyway, on account of her reported confusion about the script and some of the terminology within it. Legend has it that on a read-through of the script, she asked if Warp Drive was just off Earl's Court. On the run-up to Earthshock transmission, the Radio Times, the BBC's own listing and feature weekly magazine that was produced in-house, offered John Nathan Turner a photo shoot opportunity featuring the Cybermen. This would most likely have appeared on the front cover of the magazine. John Nathan Turner declined this offer, and other than the standard release notes of the editors, did not provide anything further. Some of the cast were reported to be upset by this decision, as it denied them a front page cover of the Radio Times. The Radio Times had previous form of ruining plots of stories, or providing spoilers, as they're now known, and John Nathan Turner was very alive to this. The challenge here was that there was a required collaboration between producers and the magazine editors, given that both fell under the BBC management. Barry Letts, producer of the programme in the early 1970s, had a number of clashes with the Radio Times. In their published preview notes for Spearhead from Space, they revealed that the characters in the upcoming programme were, in fact, Autons. In 1974, the Radio Times struck again, to Barry Letts' dismay. Invasion of the Dinosaurs was originally simply titled Invasion, with the intention being that the audience did not know who or what was invading. The evasive episode notes went out to the Radio Times to protect the plot, only for them to include some cartoon work on the same page, making it clear that it was dinosaurs behind the invasion. Matthew Waterhouse, who played Adric, was featured on the cast credits to the subsequent story, Time Flight. John Nathan Turner deliberately included a post-death cameo of Adric in this story, to get him a story credit and keep the eagle-eyed fans none the wiser as to his demise. He also released a photo to Doctor Who magazine of Matthew Waterhouse on the set of Time Flight. In the first two episodes listed for the Radio Times, David Banks and Mark Hardy were listed as Controller and Lieutenant to disguise their cyber roles. As these two actors reprised their roles over the remainder of the classic series, this trick was only achievable once. I was only 4 years old when this story was broadcast, so I have no memory of it. Therefore, I reached out to the Doctor Who army of fans to see if John Nathan Turner's attempts to keep the plot a secret worked. So it would seem that it did, and full respect to JNT for his efforts on this, leaving little to chance. Location filming was completed in a day. On Thursday, the 29th of October 1981, a small crew set off to Springwell Quarry in Hertfordshire. This location had been used previously in The Three Doctors, and would be used again in The Twin Dilemma and Delta and the Bannermen. A relatively simple filming segment requiring no set dressing or effects other than lighting, the crew started at 6:30 a.m. and finished by 5 p.m. The total location footage used for this story coming in at just under 6 minutes, with stock footage being used for the hillside establishing shot. But the studio filming didn't go as smoothly. Recorded over 2 blocks at Studio 8 of the BBC Television Centre on the 10th to 12th of November and 24th to 26th of November 1981, Tensions were higher between cast and crew. Due to the pace and intensity of the shoot, director Peter Grimwade consistently clashed with the cast. Eric Saward later joked that if the prop guns on set were real, then Grimwade would have been a viable target. One of the clashes that was reported was between Grimwade and the lighting team. They wanted to light the sets up using the overhead gantry lights, but Grimwade was insistent that they used a softer floor lighting. As you would expect, the director pulled rank and gave us a perfectly lit atmospheric environment. A good example of where a director may not have pulled rank was Pennant Roberts for Warriors of the Deep, which has been frequently criticised for its harsh and overlit sets. Peter Grimwade, in going with the feature film movie intention, directed scenes with high intensity, rapid scene and angle shifts, and the careful building of tangible tension. The studio filming suffered a short delay when an actor playing a Cyberman, Michael Gordon Brown, suffered from a severe case of claustrophobia. The mask on the new Cybermen costumes were bolted in place, and this caused, quite understandably, this actor to refuse to continue filming. So a prompt search was commenced of acting agencies that could provide an actor over 6 foot tall to fill, literally, his boots. As is standard in any production, the design and makeup team choose and implement the actor's on-screen look. Beryl Reid, however, was having none of this and insisted that she keep her trademark beehive hairstyle, albeit she did allow it to be dyed a slightly darker colour. During the episode, clips of Cybermen were used from The 10th Planet, The Wheel in Space, and Revenge of the Cybermen. These were rendered in monochrome to maintain consistency. Finding these exact clips fell to the unofficial series advisor, Ian Levine. He was tasked with sourcing the historical footage of previous Doctors, with the exception of John Pertwee, who was to meet the Cybermen in the future, with his only criteria being find shots of the Doctor next to a Cyberman. Using his extensive knowledge of the stories, Levine duly delivered. The story contains an iconic scene, and one the likes of which had never been seen on British television before. The Cyberman attempting to burst through the bulkhead door was both innovative and creative, and the relatively simple effect worked exceptionally well.
Oh, well done, Doctor.
Director Peter Grimwade made use of a triple screen split with masking and colour separation overlay to achieve the visuals of 21 Cybermen marching along the corridor. The scream emitted by Janet Fielding in the TARDIS was genuine. A spark from the console effect struck her on the head. John Nathan Turner decided on the silent rolling credits after seeing an episode of Coronation Street in 1964 do a similar thing to acknowledge the passing of the main character in that programme, Martha Longhurst. Peter Davison wasn't a fan of this ending and thought it to be cheesy. John Nathan Turner went on record to say that Earthshock was an absolute nightmare to make.
And Doctor Who continues his latest adventure tomorrow on BBC One at 7:05.
Broadcast in an almost anonymous position on a Monday and Tuesday evening, Earthshock was not especially set up to succeed. The Monday broadcasts went out at 6:55 p.m. against Nature, an ITV television series. The Tuesday broadcast went out slightly later at 7:05 p.m. against Regional News on ITV. Thankfully, Earthshock avoided the Coronation Street clash that it would encounter only a few years later, and would all but seal the fate of the programme in respect to viewing figures. However, despite this broadcast slot and a refusal by John Nathan Turner to provide publicity material, the series fared very well in the ratings and vastly improved upon the previous season. The public and fans alike responded very positively to the story both at the time and over many years since. While the plot has attracted some criticism for being a little superficial, and the performance of Beryl Reid is considered at odds with the mood of the drama, Earthshock justifies its status as a Doctor Who classic, and certainly one of the strongest stories of the Davison era. It topped a number of fans' polls in all areas, and its viewing figures were good, with peak viewing of 9.9 million viewers for episode 1, oddly before the reveal of the Cybermen. These figures fluctuated but never dropped below 8.8 million viewers for episode 2, again, oddly, as this was after the Cyberman reveal. Perhaps the Cyberman's impact didn't contribute to the viewing figures as much as John Nathan Turner may have thought. These viewing figures were, on average, 3 million above the end of the penultimate story of the previous season, The Keeper of Traken. For British viewing audiences of the time, 3 million was a big difference. The series did receive some complaints from the viewing public. most obviously on the death of Adric and the very serious way that it was presented. Doctor Who by this time was an adult programme that attracted lots of young viewers, as opposed to a children's programme that attracted adult viewers, as was its original intention. As such, many parents felt the topic of a death wasn't in good taste or delivered well. Later in the same year as Adric's on-screen death, Will Lee, an actor on the children's TV show Sesame Street, died, and the writing team made the decision to incorporate this into the show, with the death of his character, Mr. Hooper.
Ta-da! Oh, look at that one. That's nice. So beautiful. That's nice. Yeah.
Big Bird, don't you remember we told you Mr. Hooper died? He's dead.
Oh, yeah. I remember.
The writing team at the Children's Television Network did an exceptional job on covering and teaching the concept of grief in this safe environment, something I'm sure that John Nathan Turner was attempting, rather than just delivering mere shock. In addition to the complaints of Adric's death, one viewer felt compelled to complain about the scene with the Cyberman walking around with a plastic bag on his head. JNT replied, likely with a sigh, that children should not play with plastic bags. The story was novelised for the Target range by Ian Marter, numbered 78 in the collection, and released in August 1983. Marter, who previously appeared in the series as John Anderton in the 1973 Pertwee adventure The Carnival of Monsters, and more notably as Dr. Harry Sullivan during the early Tom Baker era, novelised 8 other stories before his untimely death in 1986.
Left the show, you began doing something extremely interesting, which none of the other actors on the show could possibly claim, and that is, you started writing the novelization. First, what is a novelization?
Well, novelization in terms of Doctor Who is really simply writing a novel from the original television story. So you get the script and see a tape, and then you're told to go away and get on with it.
And you began to do that after your period of time?
That's right. Well, after my time on Doctor Who, nobody else would give me a job as an actor for a while, so...
The publication of Earthshock occurred when Target Books were using bland photos of Peter Davison on the cover. There are reasons for this. Well, 2 actually. At the time, the Target range were releasing fairly regularly a backlog of novelisations from previous incarnations of the Doctor. They were very keen to ensure that buyers were well aware that with a purchase they were getting the current Doctor in a brand new story. Well, in print at least. So Doctor 5 was to feature up front and centre with no other distractions. The second reason sits squarely with the agent of Peter Davison. He suggested that should Target Books use an illustration of his client, as they'd done previously with other actors, then his client would be due a fee for the use of his likeness. Target Books declined, but used photos of the actor made available to them by the BBC under their licence agreement. When Target Books realised how dull these covers were, they used artists to create something a bit more becoming. During this period, Andrew Skilleter produced some fantastic artwork. Colin Baker's agent seemed even more militant than that of Peter Davison, for the image of the 6th Doctor didn't appear at all on the original Target covers, photo or illustration. This was relaxed in later years in the Sylvester McCoy era, resulting in some amazing cover art from Alistair Pearson. A Virgin Blue Spine reprint in 1992 was adorned with a beautiful new piece of artwork by Alistair Pearson. BBC Enterprises released the story on VHS with cover art by Andrew Skilleter. The DVD release was made in 2003 with a photo montage cover. On the 17th of November 2018, the story was shown on the big screen of the British Film Institute at South Bank in London. Eric Saward and Matthew Waterhouse were in attendance and took questions from the audience. A Blu-ray release of this story was made in 2021 as part of the Season 21 box set, again with some beautiful packaging. In 2023, the BBC edited this story into a 90-minute special for Tales of the TARDIS, bookended by new segments with Peter Davison and Janet Fielding reprising their roles. Despite the severe logistical constraints, the nightmare of 300 scenes shot in 6 days, the commitment of the creative team, particularly Eric Saward and Peter Grimwade, delivered a high-stakes, action-orientated plot that successfully realised the mandate for a feature film-like television production. The Cybermen redesign, driven by the need to appeal to the Star Wars generation, successfully transitioned the monster from a figure of gothic horror to a sleek industrial military threat, whilst taking steps to ensure the viewer was under no illusion that there were humans under this metal. The decision to kill Adric was an essential narrative mechanism to reset the tone of the Fifth Doctor's era and create a sense of jeopardy. As alluded to at the start of this documentary, the strengths of this story fed directly into some of the weaknesses that were to follow. The inclusion of shock, violence, fast-paced action, and a well-polished end product led all to believe that this was the way forward for this era of the Doctor. However, Earthshock achieved the impossible in that it incorporated all these elements, and it still worked. It was a feat that the production team struggled to replicate. Echoes of Earthshock can be seen in many of the later Davison stories, and the obsession to replicate it resulted in other stories that could have been fantastic being pulled down by the Earthshock effect. Irrespective of the later impact this story had on other productions, over 4 episodes broadcast in the UK over chilly March evenings in 1982, Earthshock did exactly what it set out to do. It shocked an entire generation of fans, the memories of which still linger to this day.